She was running late to her best friend's wedding when she literally crashed into him, sending champagne glasses flying and leaving both of them soaked. What Emily didn't know was that the handsome stranger wasn't just any guest. He was Brian Pfizer, the billionaire whose cold reputation preceded him. But instead of anger, something unexpected flashed in his eyes. That chaotic collision at a wedding would change both their lives forever, proving that sometimes the worst first impressions lead to the most passionate love stories. And when he later showed up as the investor in her architectural project, that's when things really got complicated. What if I told you that the most embarrassing moment of your life could lead to your greatest love story? That's exactly what happened to Emily, and it all started with a desperate race against the clock. The morning of her best friend's wedding had been chaotic from the start. Emily's alarm failed to go off. Her taxi got stuck in traffic, and by the time she reached the hotel, she was already 20 minutes late. The ceremony was about to start, and there she was, sprinting through the elegant hallways of the Grand Plaza Hotel, her bridesmaid dress hiked up around her knees. Just get there, she muttered to herself, clutching her bouquet in one hand and holding her strappy heels in the other. The marble floor felt cool beneath her bare feet as she rounded the corner at full speed. The wedding was being held in the Crystal Ballroom, which according to the signs was just down this hallway and to the right. Emily glanced at her watch. 3 minutes until the bride was scheduled to walk down the aisle. If she could just make it to the bridal suite first, maybe she could slip into line without anyone noticing her absence. She quickly stepped into her heels, wobbling as she tried to fasten the straps while still moving forward. "These death traps are going to be the end of me," she grumbled, struggling to balance on the 4-inch stilettos that had seemed like such a good idea when the bride picked them out months ago. With her shoes finally secured, Emily broke into an awkward half-run, half-wobble down the final stretch of hallway. The double doors to the ballroom were just ahead, and she could hear the string quartet playing inside. She was going to make it after all. And then it happened. As she rounded the final corner, head down and focused on not twisting an ankle, Emily slammed full force into what felt like a brick wall. Except brick walls don't grunt when you hit them. The impact sent her reeling backward, bouquet flying from her hands in a shower of pink and white petals. Her arms windmilled wildly as she fought to maintain balance. But it was a losing battle. Emily felt herself falling, the expensive carpet rushing up to meet her face. But the impact never came. Instead, strong hands gripped her upper arms, steadying her just inches from disaster. "In a hurry?" a deep voice asked, the tone somewhere between amused and surprised. Emily looked up and up into the most striking face she'd ever seen. Dark hair styled to perfection, jawline that could cut glass, and piercing blue eyes that were currently studying her with undisguised interest. The man holding her upright radiated an unmistakable aura of power, from his perfectly tailored charcoal suit to his confident stance. "No, I just thought I'd sprint through a hotel in heels for fun," Emily retorted, before she could stop herself. Her mother had always warned her that her mouth would get her into trouble one day. "Sorry," she added quickly. "I'm late for my best friend's wedding. I'm supposed to be a bridesmaid, but at this rate, I'll be lucky if she ever speaks to me again." Instead of looking offended, the corners of the stranger's mouth twitched upward. "A bridesmaid emergency. That explains the Olympic-level sprinting in formal wear." Emily bent down to gather the scattered flowers, painfully aware of how disheveled she must look. "These stupid heels are like walking on stilts," she muttered, trying to reassemble her bouquet into something presentable. When she tried to stand, she felt a sharp tug. To her horror, the hem of her dress had caught on the buckle of her shoe, leaving her awkwardly hunched over and unable to straighten without tearing the delicate fabric. The humiliation was complete. Here she was, late, disheveled, and now trapped by her own clothing in front of the most attractive man she'd ever crashed into. "Allow me," he said, crouching down beside her. Long fingers carefully worked to free the satin material from the metal clasp, his movement surprisingly gentle for hands that looked so strong. "There," he said after a moment, standing and offering her a hand up. "Thanks," Emily said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "And sorry again for using you as a crash pad." "I've had worse introductions," he replied with that same half-smile. You should probably— The ceremony, Emily gasped, suddenly remembering why she'd been running in the first place. I have to go. Without waiting for a response, she gathered her dress in one hand and took off toward the bridal suite, feeling his eyes on her back as she fled. The bridal party was lined up and ready, the bride's face transforming from worry to anger as Emily slipped into her place. Where have you been? Hissed Megan, the maid of honor. Long story, Emily whispered back, trying to catch her breath and straighten her hair at the same time. Tell you later. The wedding coordinator gave them the signal, and the procession began. Emily stepped through the double doors into the ballroom, focusing on keeping time with the music and not tripping over her own feet. She was so concentrated on walking gracefully that she was halfway down the aisle before she noticed him. There, standing in the front row, on the groom's side, was the man she'd crashed into. He was watching her with undisguised interest, that same hint of amusement playing around his mouth. Emily nearly missed a step when their eyes met. A jolt of electricity passing between them that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with an inexplicable connection. It wasn't until the reception, when she overheard a conversation between two guests, that Emily learned the identity of the man she'd literally run into. Brian Pfizer rarely attends these sorts of functions. A woman in an expensive-looking blue dress was saying, I'm surprised he came, even for Tom's wedding. Well, when you're worth billions, you can pick and choose which events to grace with your presence, her companion replied. Emily nearly choked on her champagne. Brian Pfizer? The Brian Pfizer? The notoriously private CEO whose financial empire was rumored to control markets across 3 continents? The man known for his ruthless business tactics and ice-cold demeanor? That couldn't be right. The man who had helped her up, who had carefully untangled her dress with those patient hands, didn't match the cutthroat reputation of Brian Pfizer. And yet, when she glanced across the room and found him still watching her, there was no denying the authority he projected, even standing perfectly still. Throughout the ceremony, she'd felt his gaze on her multiple times, and each time she'd looked up, he'd been watching her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. Why would someone like him be so interested in someone like her, a clumsy, late bridesmaid who had literally crashed into his life? In the world of the ultra-wealthy, people don't simply stare, they assess, calculate, and move on. So why was Brian Pfizer, a man who could crush careers with a casual phone call, unable to take his eyes off a bridesmaid who seemed to be a walking disaster? Emily couldn't shake the weight of his gaze, a sensation that followed her like a shadow throughout the ceremony. That's not normal, whispered Jessica, another bridesmaid, leaning close to Emily during a brief moment when the officiant was speaking. Brian Pfizer doesn't get involved with anyone, ever. A chill ran down Emily's spine as she realized the intensity of those blue eyes following her around the room wasn't just in her imagination. It was breaking a pattern that had the entire wedding buzzing with speculation. She glanced up again, almost involuntarily, and sure enough, he was watching her from his seat, his expression unreadable, yet somehow charged with interest. What do you mean? Emily whispered back, trying to maintain her focus on the ceremony, while her curiosity pulled her attention elsewhere. Jessica's eyes widened slightly. Do you have any idea who he really is? Brian heads the largest financial consulting firm on the East Coast. People say he can end careers with a single phone call. He's brilliant, ruthless, and completely closed off emotionally. Nobody gets close to him. The information should have sent Emily retreating into self-preservation mode. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. If Brian Pfizer was truly this cold, calculating figure who never showed interest in anyone, why had he reacted with such unexpected patience when she crashed into him? Why had there been that flicker of genuine amusement in his eyes, rather than the annoyance she'd deserved? Throughout the rest of the ceremony, Emily found herself hyper-aware of the social dynamics swirling around them. She noticed the sidelong glances from guests, the subtle whispers behind programs, as people observed Brian's unusual behavior. His attention was creating a ripple effect through the gathering, making her feel simultaneously special and exposed. Emily had always prided herself on her confidence and outspoken nature, yet in the orbit of Brian's power, she felt a strange psychological barrier forming, not just because of who he was, but because of how his presence affected everyone around him. The wedding guests seemed to part instinctively when he moved through a space, their deference creating an invisible force field around him. "He's watching you again," Jessica murmured, as they stood for the final blessing. "I've known him for years through mutual friends, and I've never seen him look at anyone like that." "Like what?" Emily asked, genuinely confused about what was happening. "Like you're a puzzle he can't solve. Like you're actually real to him." The ceremony concluded, and as the newlyweds made their way back down the aisle, Emily found herself wrestling with conflicting emotions. Her rational mind screamed caution. Men with that much power were dangerous, especially to someone whose career could be affected by their influence. Yet, another part of her couldn't help but feel a pull toward the mystery he represented. What made the situation even more unsettling was how his behavior contradicted everything she'd just learned about him. The man Jessica described would have been irritated by Emily's clumsiness, perhaps even cruel about it. Instead, he'd shown a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation. The contradiction created a puzzle that Emily couldn't stop trying to solve. As the wedding party moved toward the reception area, Emily caught glimpses of Brian speaking with other guests. With them, he maintained a polite but distant demeanor, his posture perfect, his expressions controlled. Yet, each time his gaze found her across the room, something changed, a slight softening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his stance. "He's coming this way," Jessica warned, her voice dropping even lower. "Don't look now, but he's definitely headed toward you." Emily felt her heart rate quicken, an annoying betrayal of her attempt to remain composed. She'd never considered herself easily intimidated, but there was something about Brian Fizer that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, exhilarated, but aware of the danger. "Why would someone like him be interested in someone like me?" Emily asked, more to herself than to Jessica. "That's what everyone's wondering," Jessica replied. "Maybe you're the first person who didn't treat him like he's terrifying." That was true, Emily realized. In their collision, she'd been too focused on her own embarrassment to be intimidated by him. She'd spoken to him naturally, with her usual sarcasm intact. Perhaps that was unusual enough to catch his attention in a world where people typically approached him with careful calculation. The reception began, and Emily made a concentrated effort to focus on her bridesmaid duties, rather than the magnetic pull she felt whenever Brian entered her awareness. Yet she couldn't help noticing how he maintained a perfect social mask with everyone else. Polite, reserved, impeccably controlled. It made his interest in her all the more confounding. "He's watching you again," another friend whispered, as Emily helped adjust the bride's train for photos. "Would everyone please stop telling me that?" Emily whispered back, her nervousness manifesting as irritation. Throughout the reception dinner, Emily became increasingly aware that she wasn't the only one who noticed Brian's attention. Guests were watching the unusual dynamic unfold, some with curiosity, others with surprise. A few of the women gave her looks that ranged from envy to warning. Emily found herself caught in an internal tug-of-war. Her natural instinct for self-preservation urged her to keep her distance from a man whose power could easily overwhelm her. Yet her curiosity about the contradiction between his reputation and his behavior toward her kept pulling her toward him, like a gravitational force. It was during the toasts that Emily finally allowed herself to really look at him, to try to understand the mystery. Their eyes met across the room, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained mask seemed to slip. There was something almost vulnerable in his expression, a hint that beneath the controlled exterior lay a man capable of genuine emotion. That glimpse changed everything. Emily realized that what made Brian Fizer truly intimidating wasn't his wealth or power, but the possibility that he might be more complex than the cold, calculating figure everyone described. The idea that he might be capable of real connection, real interest, real feeling, that was far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart than any business reputation. There's something magnetic about the person we tell ourselves to avoid. The harder Emily tried to focus on her bridesmaid responsibilities, checking on the guest book, making sure the bride had water, coordinating with the photographers, the more her attention drifted to the magnetic force across the reception hall. Brian's gaze followed her with an intensity that made her skin tingle, even as she pretended not to notice. She could feel the weight of his eyes each time she laughed with another guest or adjusted a centerpiece, like an invisible thread, pulling her awareness back to him. While the psychology of attraction often pushes us toward what we're determined to avoid, Emily was fighting it with everything she had and failing miserably. The wedding reception swirled around her in a blur of white tulle and champagne flutes, but all she could think about was the man who'd seen through her facade from the moment they collided. "Emily, the bride needs you. For photos," another bridesmaid called out, snapping her back to reality. Emily nodded, grabbing a glass of Cabernet from a passing server to steady her nerves. She turned quickly, eager to escape the magnetic field of Brian's attention, and walked straight into the very person she'd been avoiding all evening. Time slowed as the dark red liquid splashed across Brian's impeccable black suit, creating a Rorschach test of embarrassment across his chest and abdomen. The glass slipped from her fingers, landing with a soft thud on the carpet instead of shattering, which somehow made the moment even more excruciating in its quiet disaster. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her face burning. "I'm so sorry. This is beyond mortifying." Where most powerful men would have exploded with anger, or at least shown irritation, Brian remained remarkably composed. That same intriguing half-smile from their first collision returned, his eyes reflecting not fury, but something closer to amusement. "We seem destined to collide, don't we?" His voice was soft, meant only for her ears. Emily frantically grabbed cocktail napkins from a nearby table. "I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm not usually this destructive," he offered, the smile now reaching his eyes. "I was going to say clumsy, but destructive works too." She dabbed hopelessly at the spreading stain. "This suit probably costs more than my rent." Instead of the expected cold dismissal, Brian gently caught her wrist, stopping her futile attempts at damage control. "Leave it. Come to the bar with me instead." Emily blinked in surprise. "Shouldn't you be trying to salvage your suit?" "Some things aren't meant to be salvaged," he said, with peculiar significance. "Some disasters lead to better places." The invitation threw Emily completely off balance. This wasn't the response she'd anticipated from the intimidating CEO, whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. Yet here he was, casually inviting her for a drink, as if she hadn't just ruined his expensive attire twice. At the bar, Brian nodded to the bartender, who seemed to recognize him immediately. "Macallan 18, neat," he said before turning to Emily. "And for the lady." Emily could sense his expectation. Something sweet, fruity, perhaps with an umbrella, the kind of drink people often assumed women preferred. "Bullet rye, neat," she said instead, noticing with satisfaction the slight raise of his eyebrow. "Not what I expected," he admitted. "I'm guessing that doesn't happen to you often. People defying your expectations." His eyes studied her with new interest. "Almost never." The bartender returned with their drinks, and Emily took a sip of the amber liquid, letting it burn pleasantly down her throat. The alcohol and social setting were already lowering her inhibitions, making it easier to engage with the man she'd been determined to avoid. "So, Emily," he said her name, as if testing how it felt in his mouth, "do you make a habit of crashing into people and spilling things on them? Or am I just special?" A laugh escaped her, genuine and unfiltered. "Consider yourself chosen. I save my special brand of chaos for a select few." Something shifted in Brian's expression, a crack in the composed facade. "Lucky me," he said, and for the first time, Emily realized that perhaps she unsettled him, just as much as he unsettled her. "Your reputation doesn't match your reactions," she ventured, feeling bolder. "People say Brian Pfizer doesn't tolerate mistakes. Yet here I am, 2 catastrophes deep, and you're buying me whiskey." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, considering her words. "Perhaps you shouldn't believe everything you hear. Or perhaps there's something about wine stains and flying bouquets that brings out your softer side." That earned a genuine laugh from him, a deep, rich sound that seemed to surprise even him. Heads turned in their direction, guests clearly shocked to see the notoriously serious businessman actually laughing. Emily felt an unexpected surge of triumph. Making Brian Pfizer laugh felt like solving a complex puzzle others had given up on. "You know," he said, leaning slightly closer. "In my world, people don't speak to me the way you do. Is that a complaint?" "It's refreshing." His eyes held hers, and Emily felt the power dynamics shift. For all his wealth and influence, she'd managed to catch him off guard, to make him feel something unplanned. "Most people are too intimidated to be real with me. Maybe you need more clumsy bridesmaids in your life," Emily suggested, finishing her whiskey. "Maybe I just need one specific bridesmaid." The statement hung between them, too direct to misinterpret. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken as Brian's gaze intensified, the playful banter giving way to something more electric. Despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance, there was no denying the chemistry building between them, a force as real and tangible as the whiskey warming her veins. "I should get back," she said finally, setting down her empty glass. "Bridesmaid duties." Brian nodded, though his eyes said he understood this was retreat, rather than responsibility. Of course, as Emily walked away from the bar, she knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had changed. The connection between them had become impossible to ignore. Not just attraction, but something more complex, a recognition that transcended their brief acquaintance. Her carefully constructed walls were crumbling, brick by emotional brick. Behind her, she could feel Brian's eyes following her retreat, neither of them pretending anymore that this was just casual conversation between wedding guests. The elegant reception, with its string quartet and champagne towers, had transformed from a simple celebration into the backdrop for something entirely unexpected, the beginning of a story neither of them had planned. The string quartet shifted to a slower melody, and that's when Emily felt his presence behind her, before she even turned around. There's something about the language of bodies that needs no translation. She knew it was Brian, the way the air seemed to change density, the anticipation that climbed her spine. When she finally turned, his eyes held a challenge that needed no words. "One dance," he said simply, his hand extended in the space between them. No elaborate request, no room for polite denial. Just two words that somehow carried the weight of everything unsaid since their first collision. Emily glanced at his outstretched hand, her mind racing through every reason this was a terrible idea. She'd spent the entire reception carefully orchestrating her movements to avoid exactly this scenario. Yet here he was, calling her bluff, with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a half smile. "We can stop pretending we haven't been watching each other all night," Brian added, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Unless you're afraid?" That did it. Emily's internal debate screeched to a halt at the subtle challenge in his tone. Before her rational mind could overrule her instincts, she placed her hand in his. "I'm not afraid of you, Brian Pfizer." The moment their hands connected, something electric passed between them. Not just the expected spark of attraction, but something deeper, a current of recognition that caught them both off guard. His fingers closed around hers with a gentle pressure that belied his powerful presence, and suddenly they were moving toward the center of the dance floor. Emily had expected many things from this moment. Awkwardness, perhaps, or the stilted movements of a man who viewed dancing as a necessary social obligation. What she hadn't anticipated was how naturally Brian's body synchronized with hers. His hand settled at the small of her back with confident precision, guiding her into the first step of a waltz with such fluid grace that her body responded before her mind could catch up. "You seem surprised," he noted, reading her expression with unsettling accuracy. "I didn't expect you to actually know how to dance," Emily admitted, finding her rhythm as they moved together across the floor. It seemed too human. His laugh was unexpected, genuine amusement, rather than practiced politeness. "I contain multitudes, Emily, but I'm curious, what exactly do you think I am, if not human?" As they moved together, Emily became acutely aware of the physical conversation happening between them. His lead was confident, but not controlling, leaving space for her to respond rather than simply follow. Their bodies moved in perfect synchrony, creating a dialogue of movement that somehow felt more intimate than their actual words. "I think you're someone who calculates every move," she finally answered, surprised by her own honesty. "Someone who doesn't leave anything to chance, especially not how people perceive you." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in consideration. "And yet, here I am, dancing with the one person at this entire wedding who seems determined to see past all that. Hardly a calculated move, wouldn't you say? The question hung between them as they turned, the movement bringing them closer. Emily could feel the warmth of his breath, the solid presence of his chest, just inches from hers. The crowded ballroom seemed to fade around them, creating a bubble where only they existed, moving together in three-quarter time, while having a conversation that went far deeper than casual reception small talk. "Why me?" Emily asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could contain it. "You could dance with anyone here. Half the women in this room have been trying to catch your eye all night." Brian's expression shifted, something unguarded flashing across his features. For a moment, the carefully controlled CEO disappeared, replaced by something softer and infinitely more vulnerable. "Because none of them look at me the way you do," he said simply. "Like you're trying to solve a puzzle rather than access a bank account." His honesty disarmed her, creating a moment of silence between them, filled only with the physical communication of their movement. Emily, suddenly, understood what researchers meant about dance creating a unique form of intimacy. They were having multiple conversations simultaneously, one with words and another with their bodies. "This feels different," Brian admitted after several measures passed in silence. The admission seemed difficult for him, as though revealing even this small vulnerability went against deeply ingrained habits. "Dancing with you, it's not like anything I've experienced before." Emily looked up at him, suddenly aware that they had drawn closer, without either of them consciously deciding to do so. "Different how? Like I'm not performing a role for once." His eyes held hers, refusing to let her look away. "Do you know how rare that is? To feel like you can just exist without calculating every word and gesture?" As the music carried them across the floor, Emily felt the walls she'd carefully constructed beginning to crumble. The enigmatic businessman was showing her glimpses of something real beneath the polished exterior. Not dramatic confessions of hidden depths, but something far more compelling, genuine human connection. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "I feel it too." Their movements slowed as the music neared its conclusion, neither of them quite ready for this moment to end. The physical closeness had created a space where honesty seemed not just possible, but necessary. Emily realized she had stopped fighting the connection between them, allowing herself to be fully present in this moment, with a man who somehow saw her more clearly, after a few encounters, than people who had known her for years. "What happens when the music stops?" she asked, feeling his hand tighten almost imperceptibly at her waist. "That depends," Brian responded, his voice matching her quiet tone, "on whether you keep running, or if you're finally ready to admit that whatever this is between us isn't going away by pretending it doesn't exist." The final notes of the waltz hung in the air as they came to a stop, still holding each other in the middle of the dance floor. For 3 minutes, they had moved as one entity, their bodies communicating what words couldn't express. Now, standing still, Emily could feel the aftershocks of that connection reverberating through her. "I should go check on the bride," she said finally, though she made no move to step away. "You should," Brian agreed, equally motionless. "But we both know this conversation isn't over." When he finally released her hand, Emily felt the absence of his touch like a physical loss. She took a step back, breaking the bubble that had formed around them, allowing the sounds and sights of the reception to flood back in. But something fundamental had shifted during those 3 minutes of shared movement. 3 days after the wedding, Emily had almost convinced herself she'd never see Brian Pfizer again. She'd neatly filed away their electric dance as nothing more than a wedding moment, magical but fleeting, destined to become just another story she'd eventually stop telling herself. Monday morning, reality had other plans, though. The universe wasn't just playing matchmaker, it was forcing their worlds to collide in the most inconvenient way possible. Emily strode into the conference room at her architectural firm, coffee in hand, mind already cycling through presentation points for their routine project meeting. She'd spent hours refining the Richmond Tower designs, the firm's most ambitious project to date, and potentially the cornerstone of her career. As lead architect, she needed to impress the investors who would be joining them today. She froze mid-step. There, at the head of the table where partners typically sat, was Brian Pfizer. Not a mirage, not a dream, but the actual flesh-and-blood man she'd been desperately trying to erase from her thoughts. "Ms. Walker?" he said with a polite nod, his voice carrying that same measured control she remembered from their dance. "Good to see you again." The room's atmosphere shifted instantly. Emily felt her colleagues' attention bouncing between them like a ping-pong ball, curiosity etched on their faces. They clearly caught something in Brian's tone, a hint of familiarity that suggested prior acquaintance. "Mr. Pfizer," she managed, proud that her voice remained steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "I wasn't aware you were joining us today." Her boss, David, jumped in enthusiastically. "Brian's firm has just signed on as the lead investor for Richmond Tower. Can you believe our luck? The project budget has practically doubled overnight." Emily's grip tightened around her coffee cup. The project budget doubled, her career prospects soaring, and all because of the one man she'd been determined to forget. "Emily is our star architect," David continued, oblivious to her internal crisis. "She's been the driving force behind the Richmond Tower design from day one." Brian's expression remained professionally pleasant, but Emily caught the slight upward curl at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, I've had the opportunity to review Ms. Walker's portfolio. Her innovative approach to sustainable urban design is precisely why we're interested in this project." The meeting proceeded with excruciating normality. Emily delivered her presentation flawlessly, years of professional training kicking in, despite the chaos in her mind. Throughout her explanation of the structural innovations and ecological considerations, Brian asked pointed, intelligent questions that demonstrated he'd thoroughly studied the project proposals. What made it worse was that his questions were good, challenging her in ways that actually improved the concept. His business acumen complemented her architectural vision in ways that, under different circumstances, she would have found exhilarating. Her colleagues remained completely unaware of the electric undercurrent flowing between them. To everyone else, this was simply a productive meeting between professionals. Only Emily could feel the weight of Brian's gaze when others were focused on the projection screen, the slight shift in his voice when addressing her directly. The power dynamics had shifted dramatically. At the wedding, they'd been guests on equal footing. Now, he wasn't just a wealthy, influential man. He was effectively signing her paychecks. His approval or disapproval could make or break the project she'd poured her heart and soul into for the past year. When the meeting finally ended and people began filtering out, Emily remained rooted to her chair, gathering her materials with deliberate slowness. She needed answers, and she needed them now. As if reading her thoughts, Brian lingered as well, examining the architectural model at the center of the conference table with apparent interest. When the last colleague closed the door behind them, Emily wasted no time. "Did you know?" she demanded, abandoning all pretense of professional detachment. "When you walked into this meeting, did you know I would be here?" Brian looked up from the model, his expression unreadable. "That you worked for this firm?" "Yes." "That you were the lead architect on this specific project?" "No, not until I saw your name on the team list last week." "And you didn't think to mention this when we met at the wedding?" Emily's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Would it have changed anything?" he countered. "Would you have acted differently during our dance if you'd known I was potentially investing in your project?" The question hit uncomfortably close to home. She would have kept even more distance, erected even higher walls. "This creates a professional conflict," she said instead, redirecting the conversation to safer ground. "Does it?" Brian approached, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of his cologne. "I'm an investor, Emily. I don't make design decisions. Your work speaks for itself. My personal interest in you doesn't change that." "Personal interest," she repeated, the words hanging between them. "This isn't appropriate." "What isn't appropriate is denying the connection we both felt," Brian replied, his professional veneer slipping just enough to reveal the intensity beneath. "But I understand the ethical concerns. If you prefer, I can assign another representative from my firm to attend future meetings." Emily blinked, surprised by his reasonable offer. "You would do that?" "I respect your professional boundaries," he said simply, "but I won't pretend I'm not intrigued by this situation." "Intrigued?" she echoed flatly. My career is potentially on the line, and you find it intriguing. Your career is secure because you're talented, Brian corrected her. The project is funded because it's brilliant. Those facts exist independently of whatever is happening between us. Emily gathered her portfolio, needing physical distance to clear her head. Nothing is happening between us, Mr. Pfizer. We had one dance at a wedding, and now we have a professional relationship. That's all. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. Emily. The way he said her name, soft yet commanding, made her pause despite herself. We both know it's not that simple. She didn't turn around. It has to be. Walking away, Emily realized that the wedding reception had been just the preliminary skirmish. Now the real battle would unfold in boardrooms and project meetings, with higher stakes and more complicated rules. The professional boundaries she'd always maintained so effortlessly had suddenly become a fragile defense against feelings she couldn't afford to acknowledge. The wedding's dance floor had transformed into a corporate chessboard, and somehow she suspected Brian Pfizer was several moves ahead, watching patiently as she struggled to keep her professional and personal worlds from colliding further. The corporate chessboard Emily imagined was about to become a battleground, where every project meeting turned into psychological warfare. What none of her colleagues could see was the real struggle happening beneath the surface. How do you maintain your professional composure when merely being in the same room with someone creates an electric current that threatens to short-circuit your career? Emily arrived early to every Richmond Tower meeting, armed with extra copies of blueprints, comprehensive answers to potential questions, and a mental shield she hoped would protect her from Brian's penetrating gaze. She'd established a routine: position herself on the opposite side of the conference table, speak only when necessary, and focus exclusively on the architectural aspects of the project. Her strategy was simple: treat Brian Pfizer as nothing more than a financial entity providing capital for her vision. But Brian seemed to have a different agenda entirely. I'm not convinced this atrium design maximizes the natural light patterns we discussed, he said during their third project meeting, his voice perfectly measured, as he questioned the feature Emily had spent weeks perfecting. Have you considered how the western exposure might create uncomfortable heat gain during summer afternoons? Emily felt her jaw tighten. Of course she had considered it. The calculations were right there in Section 4 of her report. The report he had clearly read, cover to cover, judging by his precise questions about details buried in the appendices. If you'll turn to page 37, Mr. Pfizer, you'll see we've incorporated specialized glazing with thermal rejection properties, specifically designed to address afternoon sun exposure, she replied, her professional tone masking the frustration building inside her. This became their new pattern. Brian would raise seemingly legitimate concerns about her designs, concerns that revealed how thoroughly he'd studied her work, and Emily would defend her choices with increasing intensity. What might have appeared as normal investor scrutiny to others felt to Emily like an elaborate game designed to keep her perpetually off balance. Did you notice how Pfizer watches her when she's presenting? Whispered Mark, one of the junior architects, to the project manager during a coffee break 3 weeks into their collaboration. It's like he's analyzing every word. It's more than that, Sophia replied, lowering her voice further. He barely acknowledges anyone else in the room. Something's definitely going on between those two. The whispers multiplied. Emily caught snippets of conversations that fell silent when she approached. Colleagues exchanged knowing glances during particularly tense exchanges. The conference room, once her professional sanctuary, had become a pressure cooker of unspoken tension. During the 5th project meeting, Brian questioned her structural approach with such persistence that Emily felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. I'm wondering if your cantilever design prioritizes aesthetic appeal over structural integrity, he said, his blue eyes never leaving hers as the room temperature seemed to rise several degrees. The cantilever design isn't just aesthetically pleasing, Mr. Pfizer. It's integral to the building's identity, Emily responded, her voice sharper than intended. And I can assure you that every aspect has been thoroughly analyzed by our structural engineers. Perhaps we could review those analyses in private? Brian suggested, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly in what could have been either a challenging smile or an invitation. The room fell silent. Her colleagues stared at their notes, suddenly fascinated by their pens and tablets. Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks as she realized everyone in the room could feel the charged atmosphere between them. After the meeting, Emily waited until her colleagues had filed out before confronting him. "What are you doing?" she demanded, closing the conference room door behind her. "Every meeting, you question my work in ways that feel deliberately designed to undermine me." Brian leaned against the table, his expression unreadable. "I'm fulfilling my role as an investor by ensuring the project meets standards of excellence." "No, you're making this professional relationship impossible," Emily countered. "Your questions aren't just about the project. They're about me." "Would you prefer I assign someone else from my firm?" he asked, echoing his earlier offer. "Someone who doesn't know your capabilities the way I do? I'd prefer you stop using these meetings as a way to—" She stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence without acknowledging what was really happening between them. Brian straightened, crossing the room to stand near the wall of windows overlooking the city skyline. "Join me on the balcony," he said. Not a request, but not quite a command either. Against her better judgment, Emily followed him through the glass doors onto the executive balcony. 37 floors above the street, the sounds of the city were muted, creating an illusion of privacy that made it dangerously easy to forget they were still in their workplace. "I'm not deliberately making your professional life difficult," Brian finally said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I'm trying to maintain appropriate boundaries while being involved in something you're passionate about." "By questioning everything I present?" Emily asked, incredulous. "By engaging with your work seriously," he corrected. "Would you prefer indifference? Should I just nod and approve everything without comment?" Emily gripped the railing, feeling the cool metal against her palms. "No, but there's a difference between professional engagement and whatever this is." "And what is this, Emily?" Brian asked, turning to face her fully, the late afternoon sun casting shadows across his features. "Because I've been trying to define it since the moment we met." The honesty in his question caught her off guard. For weeks they'd been engaged in this elaborate dance of professional pretense, never acknowledging the current running beneath their interactions. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's affecting my work, my reputation. People are talking." "I know," Brian said. "I expected maintaining professional distance would be challenging, but I didn't anticipate how difficult it would be to sit across from you in meetings, focusing on blueprints and budgets when all I can think about is—" He stopped himself, looking away toward the horizon. "This can't happen," Emily said quietly, but even to her own ears, the words lacked conviction. "Yet it is happening," Brian replied. "Every time we're in the same room, every time you defend your vision with that fire in your eyes, every time you refuse to back down when challenged." Emily felt her resolve weakening. The truth was, part of her looked forward to their verbal sparring, to the challenge of defending her ideas against someone who clearly understood and valued them. "I've built walls between us," she said. "Professional boundaries that should be respected. And I have respected them," Brian said. "But walls don't eliminate what's on the other side. They just prevent us from addressing it directly." The silence between them stretched, filled with everything they weren't saying. "I should get back," Emily finally said, turning toward the door. "I have another meeting in 20 minutes. Brian nodded, making no move to stop her. "Emily," he called as she reached for the handle, "I don't regret investing in Richmond Tower. Whatever happens, or doesn't happen, between us, your vision deserves to be realized." The sincerity in his voice made her pause, one hand on the door. "Thank you," she said without turning around, afraid of what he might see in her expression. The walls Emily built weren't just professional boundaries. They were her last defense against feelings that threatened everything she'd worked for. But what happens when those carefully constructed barriers face their ultimate test in the unexpected intimacy of a corporate kitchen where there's nowhere to hide and no more excuses? The day had been brutal. After nearly 14 hours of presentations, meetings, and endless revisions to her designs, Emily finally had the office to herself. The Richmond Tower team had filtered out one by one, leaving behind the comforting hum of the building's ventilation system and the soft glow of security lighting. She found herself drawn to the small kitchen at the back of the floor, searching for a moment of solitude to clear her mind. The kitchen was nothing special, just a small alcove with a coffee maker, mini fridge, and narrow countertop. But in that moment, it felt like sanctuary. Emily leaned against the counter, closing her eyes as she took her first deep breath of the day. The cool surface beneath her palms grounded her, bringing her racing thoughts to a momentary standstill. Running away again? The voice startled her, eyes flying open to find Brian standing in the doorway. The kitchen suddenly felt impossibly small, as if the walls were closing in around them. There was nowhere to retreat, no conference table to hide behind, no colleagues to serve as buffers, just the two of them, separated by 4 feet of tiled floor that might as well have been charged with electricity. "I needed coffee," she lied, though the empty mug in her hand betrayed her. "And I wasn't aware. I needed to report my movements to you." Brian stepped inside, closing the distance between them. The kitchen doorway behind him now seemed miles away. "You've been avoiding private conversations with me for weeks. Every time we get close to discussing what's happening between us, you find an excuse to leave." "Nothing is happening between us," Emily insisted, gripping the counter behind her. "We have a professional relationship that's already complicated enough without—" "Without what?" Brian challenged, moving closer. "Without acknowledging that every time we're in a room together, we can barely focus on anything else. Without admitting that this goes beyond Richmond Tower or any project?" Emily felt her heartbeat accelerating, her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack. The confined space amplified every sensation. His cologne, the intensity in his eyes, the tension crackling between them. In the vast office, she could maintain distance, but here in this tiny kitchen there was nowhere to hide from the truth. "This isn't appropriate," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know that. I know that we've been dancing around this since the moment we met," Brian replied, his voice softening, "and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." Emily tried to step sideways, to create some distance, but Brian placed his hand on the counter beside her, not touching her, but effectively blocking her path. The gesture wasn't threatening. She could have easily ducked under his arm or asked him to move, but something kept her rooted to the spot, caught in the gravity of this confrontation they'd been avoiding for so long. "What do you want from me?" she asked, vulnerability slipping into her tone despite her best efforts. "I want honesty," he said simply. "Just once, I want you to stop hiding behind professionalism and boundaries, and just tell me what you really feel." The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Emily felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. In this small space, with no distractions or interruptions, she was finally facing the feelings she'd been running from since that first collision. "It doesn't matter what I feel," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "There are complications here that can't be ignored. Your position, my career, the project." "I'm not asking about any of that," Brian interrupted, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "I'm asking about you and me, as people, not as investor and architect." His proximity was overwhelming, making it impossible to think clearly. Every nerve ending in Emily's body seemed hyper-aware of him, the slight rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, the intensity in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders betraying that his calm demeanor was just as much of a facade as her professional distance. "If I weren't your investor," Brian said, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper, "if you weren't so caught up in these rules and boundaries, what would you do?" The pivotal question created a psychological breaking point. The walls Emily had carefully maintained began to collapse completely, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She felt a rush of emotion that she couldn't suppress, couldn't rationalize away with professional concerns or career ambitions. Silence stretched between them, filled with everything they'd left unsaid over weeks of meetings and confrontations. The confined space of the kitchen amplified the intimacy of the moment, making it impossible to maintain emotional distance. Emily felt her resolve weakening with each passing second. "That's not fair," she finally managed, her voice barely audible. "None of this is fair," Brian admitted, "but it's real, and we both know it." He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. For a moment, Emily allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to bridge that final gap between them, to surrender to the connection they'd been fighting since that first day. The realization struck her with startling clarity. She was tired of running, tired of pretending, tired of denying what had become increasingly obvious to everyone around them. In this cramped office kitchen, Far from the grandeur of presentation rooms and executive balconies, Emily finally confronted the truth she'd been avoiding. "I would," she began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the admission she was about to make. Brian waited, not pushing, not interrupting, giving her the space to find her words, even as their physical space remained charged with unspoken tension. "I would stop pretending that I don't think about you," Emily finally confessed, her voice barely audible. "I would stop acting like I can focus when you're in the room. I would stop lying to myself about what I feel when you look at me, the way you're looking at me right now." The confession hung between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Brian's expression softened, relief, and something deeper replacing the intensity in his eyes. "Emily," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. She raised her hand, stopping him before he could say more. "But I can't," she whispered. "Not yet. Not like this." Before he could respond, Emily gathered her courage and moved past him, their shoulders brushing in the narrow space. The brief contact sent a jolt through her body, confirming everything she'd just admitted. "I need time," she said, pausing at the doorway. "This is too important to rush into without thinking it through." Brian didn't try to stop her, didn't reach for her, or call her back. Instead, he offered something that surprised her: understanding. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The sincerity in his voice made her pause, one hand on the door. "Thank you," she said without turning around, afraid of what he might see in her expression. Emily thought she could control the pace of their connection, but some decisions can't wait for careful consideration. 3 days later, in a boardroom filled with investors, Brian Pfizer would make the kind of grand gesture that defies all business logic, proving that for the first time in his life, his heart was overruling his legendary financial instincts. The Richmond Tower meeting started like any other Tuesday session. Team members filed in with their coffee cups and tablets, exchanging polite, small talk, before taking their seats around the oval mahogany table. Emily had prepared diligently for this presentation, reviewing structural modifications late into the night. She placed her portfolio on the table, carefully avoiding eye contact with Brian as he entered the room. The meeting progressed normally through the first half hour. Budget discussions, timeline updates, material sourcing challenges. Emily was mid-sentence about the new sustainability features when Brian cleared his throat, causing everyone to turn toward him. "Before we continue, I have an announcement," he said, his voice carrying that unmistakable authority that had silenced boardrooms across continents. "Effective immediately, I'm transferring my entire stake in Richmond Tower to Westbrook Partners." The room froze. Even the usually unflappable senior partners looked stunned. Emily's pen clattered to the floor, the only sound in the sudden silence. "Mr. Pfizer, that's a considerable investment to transfer," Richard, the head of finance, finally stammered. "Nearly $20 million. Is there something about the project that concerns you?" Brian's eyes never left Emily's face as he answered. "On the contrary, Richmond Tower is brilliantly conceived and perfectly viable. This has nothing to do with the project's value." Emily couldn't process what was happening. In the world of high-stakes development, investors didn't simply walk away from profitable ventures without reason. And Brian Pfizer, of all people, a man renowned for his ruthless pursuit of financial advantage, was not someone who made impulsive decisions. "I'll be available for transition questions, but Josh Henderson from Westbrook will be joining your meetings from now on. He's been thoroughly briefed and shares my confidence in the project." As the meeting dissolved into confused murmurs, Brian stood. "Ms. Reynolds, could I have a word?" His tone made it clear this wasn't actually a request. Emily followed him to the small conference room down the hall, her mind racing. The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final. "What are you doing?" she demanded, finding her voice at last. "You're walking away from millions of dollars. That doesn't make any sense." Brian loosened his tie slightly, the first crack in his perfect composure. "It makes perfect sense if you understand my motivation." "Which is what exactly?" Emily crossed her arms, trying to maintain some semblance of professional distance, even as her heart raced. "Because now there's no reason for you to keep running away," he said simply. The words hung between them, stripping away the last pretense that this was about business. "You can't be serious," Emily whispered, though she knew with absolute certainty that he was. "You're giving up your position in a multi-million-dollar project because of me? I can do whatever I want, Emily. And what I want is you." There was something profoundly disarming about his honesty. No games, no manipulation, just raw truth. Emily had spent her entire career learning to navigate the complex power dynamics of the male-dominated architecture world, always maintaining careful boundaries. But Brian had just demolished the final barrier she'd been hiding behind with a single decision. "People don't do things like this," she said, shaking her head. "Especially not people like you." "People like me?" There was a hint of amusement in his voice. "Calculated. Strategic. You analyze every business move to perfection. This is irrational." Brian took a step closer. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe for the first time in my life, I don't want to be rational." The psychological impact of his gesture wasn't lost on Emily. By removing himself from the project, he had eliminated the professional boundary she'd used to keep him at arm's length. It was the ultimate proof that his interest went far beyond temporary attraction. "This changes the power dynamic completely," she said, processing aloud. "You've sacrificed something significant to prove a point." "Not to prove a point," he corrected gently. "To remove an obstacle. You kept saying we couldn't explore what's between us because of our professional relationship. That obstacle no longer exists." Emily leaned against the conference table, trying to steady herself. "You realize this is extreme, right? Most people just ask someone to dinner." "I'm not most people," Brian replied, "and neither are you. Would dinner have been enough to convince you to stop using work as an excuse?" She couldn't answer honestly, because they both knew the truth. She would have found another reason, another barrier, another excuse. "The influence of your wealth and position makes this complicated," Emily said finally. "You can afford grand gestures that most people can't." "True, but this isn't about what I can afford to lose financially. It's about what I can't afford to lose emotionally." His vulnerability in that moment struck her deeply. Brian Pfizer, the man who supposedly calculated every move, had just made the least calculated decision of his career. For her, the realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "That depends on you. I've removed the last barrier. The question is whether you're ready to stop running." Emily studied his face, seeing beyond the powerful exterior to the man beneath. A man who had just demonstrated that his feelings for her transcended his legendary business instincts. No one had ever sacrificed anything remotely this significant for her. "I need time to process this," she said finally. Brian nodded. "I understand. Take whatever time you need." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "But Emily?" "Yes? Don't use time as just another way to run." After he left, Emily remained in the conference room alone, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. A man worth billions had just walked away from a multi-million-dollar investment simply to remove her last excuse for keeping her distance. It defied everything she thought she knew about how the world worked, especially the world of powerful men like Brian Pfizer. Her phone buzzed with a text from her colleague Mark. "What just happened? The entire office is in shock." Emily stared at the message without answering. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? How could she tell them that the most ruthless businessman in the city had just made the most irrational business decision possible, all because of feelings he couldn't control? The ruthless businessman had made his move, sacrificing millions to remove her last excuse. But Emily's final defense wasn't professional at all. It was the terror of acknowledging that someone had finally broken through her carefully constructed walls. How do you fight an enemy that's already inside your heart? Emily wandered through the city streets, long after sunset, her mind replaying Brian's impossible decision over and over. The streetlights cast long shadows as she moved without purpose, trying to make sense of a man who'd willingly walked away from $20 million just to remove her final excuse. No business tycoon throws away that kind of investment. No calculating CEO abandons a guaranteed profit, unless the math they're doing has nothing to do with money at all. By the time she reached her apartment, Emily's emotions had cycled through disbelief, anger, and a strange, terrifying hope that she wasn't quite ready to name. She kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto her couch, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer answers. Her phone buzzed with another message, probably Mark or someone else from the office still reeling from the bombshell. "Brian, had dropped. She ignored it. What could she possibly say? That the infamous Brian Pfizer had upended his business interests because of feelings? No one would believe it. She barely believed it herself. The unexpected ring of her doorbell at 11:47 p.m. made her jolt upright. She knew who it was before she even checked. Only one person would be bold enough or desperate enough to show up unannounced this late. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she moved toward the door, each step bringing her closer to a conversation she wasn't prepared to have. She opened the door to find Brian standing there, his usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled. The man who commanded boardrooms with a single glance now looked almost uncertain, his eyes searching her face. "Before you tell me to leave," he said quickly, "I need 5 minutes." Emily crossed her arms, her last defensive posture. "It's almost midnight, Brian. I don't have anything to say." "Then just listen." His voice was soft but determined. "I have something important to tell you." She hesitated before stepping aside to let him in, maintaining as much physical distance as possible. Her apartment suddenly felt too small, too intimate for this confrontation. "I've been thinking about what you asked me," Brian said, turning to face her, "about why I would walk away from Richmond Tower." "You already answered that," Emily replied, keeping her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You did it to remove the professional barrier." Brian shook his head slightly. "That's part of it, but not the whole truth." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm a man who doesn't deal well with emotions. That's never been part of my life. I never needed it." The raw honesty in his voice made Emily's defenses waver. This wasn't the calculating businessman speaking. This was simply a man struggling to articulate something he'd never had to express before. "My entire career, I've made decisions based on logic, advantages, strategic positioning," he continued. "But meeting you, crashing into you, it changed everything. For the first time, I couldn't calculate my way through a situation." Emily remained silent, afraid that any word might break whatever spell had prompted this unprecedented vulnerability from a man known for his emotional detachment. "I kept telling myself it was just attraction," Brian said, moving a step closer, "that it would pass, if I just waited it out. But it didn't pass. It got stronger, no matter how many barriers you put up, no matter how many meetings I sat through, pretending I was only there for the project." The space between them felt charged with electricity, every molecule of air vibrating with unspoken truths. "I'm in love with you, Emily," he finally said, the words landing between them like a physical presence. "And I'm completely lost in it." The confession hung in the air, transforming the atmosphere of the room. Emily stared at him, trying to process those words coming from Brian Pfizer's mouth. The man legendary for his emotional detachment, for his ruthless business decisions, for never letting personal feelings interfere with his objectives. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "I walked away from that investment because you matter more, because for the first time in my life, the numbers, the advantage, the strategic position, none of it matters compared to what I feel for you." Emily felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Here was a man who had built an empire on calculated decisions, standing before her completely vulnerable, having surrendered all his defenses. "Do you know how terrifying this is for me?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "You're Brian Pfizer. You don't do relationships. You don't fall in love. You analyze and calculate and always stay 3 steps ahead." "Not anymore," he said simply. "Not with you." The truth of his words was written across his face, a face that had appeared on business magazines, that had stared down corporate rivals, that had never revealed anything he didn't want seen. Now, it showed everything: fear, hope, and a depth of feeling that couldn't be manufactured or strategic. "What are you so afraid of, Emily?" he asked gently. The question pierced through her final defense. What was she afraid of? Not rejection. Brian had made his feelings abundantly clear. Not professional complications. He'd removed that obstacle entirely. "I'm afraid of what happens when the walls come down," she admitted. "I've spent years building them. They protect me." "From what?" "From feeling too much. From losing control." She paused, gathering courage for her own confession. from falling so completely for someone that losing them would destroy me. Brian stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. What if those walls aren't protecting you anymore? What if they're just keeping you from what you really want? The truth of his words resonated inside her. The walls that had once sheltered her had become her prison, keeping everything meaningful at a safe but hollow distance. "Stop running," Emily finally said, the words as much for herself as for him. "We've both been running from the same truth, haven't we?" He nodded, relief washing over his features as he recognized her surrender mirroring his own. Yes. When his hand reached up to gently touch her face, Emily didn't pull away. The touch wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was firm, anchoring, as if he'd finally found safe harbor after a storm. "No more barriers," she whispered. Their lips met in a kiss, unlike their previous encounters, one without uncertainty or hesitation. This wasn't a questioning kiss or an exploring kiss. It was a sealing of something that had begun the moment they'd crashed into each other, something that had grown, despite every rational reason it shouldn't have. He pulled her closer, and Emily felt the strange sensation of falling and coming home simultaneously. This wasn't the fairy tale moment she'd imagined as a girl. It was better. It was real, complicated, and terrifying in its intensity. It was surrender, not as weakness, but as the most powerful choice either of them had ever made. That night marked the death of Brian Pfizer as the world knew him. Behind closed doors, away from the watchful eyes of business associates and rivals, a different man emerged. One whose existence would have seemed impossible to anyone who'd encountered the infamous CEO in negotiations. His transformation wasn't instantaneous, but rather a gradual metamorphosis that unfolded over the months following that pivotal confession. In those first weeks of their relationship, Brian's attempts at emotional openness resembled a man learning to use muscles he'd never exercised. During their second official date, Emily watched him struggle to compliment her dress, his normally fluid speech pattern breaking as he searched for words that weren't filtered through a strategic lens. The man who could deliver cutting remarks in boardrooms found himself speechless when trying to express simple appreciation. "I've spent decades learning how to hide what I'm feeling," he admitted one evening as they walked along the waterfront. "It was never a conscious choice, more like armor I didn't realize I was putting on each morning until it became part of me." What fascinated Emily most was watching the layers peel away when Brian didn't realize she was observing him, the way his face softened when he thought she was asleep beside him, the gentleness in his hands when he tucked her hair behind her ear. These weren't calculated moves from a man playing at emotion. They were instinctive reactions from someone discovering parts of himself long buried under years of deliberate detachment. The first time Brian laughed, truly laughed without restraint, came during a dinner at her apartment when she recounted a catastrophic attempt at making soufflé for a previous boyfriend. His laughter erupted unexpectedly, rich and genuine, causing him to look almost startled by the sound of his own joy. Emily froze, spatula in hand, mesmerized by this unguarded moment. "I don't remember the last time I laughed like that," he confessed, looking almost vulnerable in his surprise. The business world began noticing the changes, too. Brian's executive assistant of 8 years nearly dropped a stack of contracts when he asked about her son's piano recital, something the old Brian would have considered irrelevant personal information. His legal team exchanged confused glances during a major acquisition meeting when he suggested postponing a deadline so the opposing team could properly prepare, a consideration for others that had never factored into his decision-making process before. Rumors spread through corporate circles about what exactly had happened to the notoriously cold-blooded Brian Pfizer. Some speculated illness or medication. Others whispered about midlife crisis or secret therapy. None guessed the truth, that the simple act of surrendering to love had initiated a profound rewiring of his emotional circuitry. Not that the transformation came without challenges. Old habits surfaced in moments of stress or uncertainty. 6 weeks into their relationship, during their first serious disagreement about his perpetual late-night work calls, Emily watched him retreat behind the familiar mask of detachment. His face emptied of expression, his voice dropping to that calculated monotone she recognized from countless news interviews. "This is what I do," he stated with clinical precision. "My work requires constant availability." But something had fundamentally changed. Where once that tone would have ended any discussion, Brian now looked troubled by his own response. He paced the room, visibly struggling with a collision between old patterns and new awareness. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted finally, voice roughened with frustration. "I don't know how to balance everything I've been with whatever I'm becoming." These moments of honesty, raw, unfiltered expressions of his internal struggle, represented the most profound shift. The Brian Pfizer who had dominated boardrooms would never have acknowledged vulnerability, much less embraced it as a pathway to growth. Yet here he was, learning that emotional intelligence required the same commitment and discipline he'd applied to business strategy. 3 months into their relationship, Brian invited Emily to a charity gala where most of his business associates would be present. It would be their first official appearance together in his professional world. Emily felt the weight of dozens of curious stares as they entered the ballroom, the whispered speculation almost audible beneath the orchestra music. "You're causing quite the stir," she murmured, squeezing his hand. "Let them talk," he replied with surprising ease. "They've been talking about me for 20 years. What happened next stunned the collected elite of the business world. Brian Pfizer, the man known for avoiding personal conversations and maintaining ruthless professional distance, guided Emily through the room, with his hand openly resting on the small of her back. He introduced her not as a vague acquaintance, but with obvious pride. When asked about the Richmond Tower project, he praised Emily's architectural vision with genuine enthusiasm, deferring to her expertise in a way that left several longtime associates visibly shocked. Most revealing was the moment Emily overheard a conversation between Brian and his longtime rival, Harrison Wells. "I hardly recognize you, Pfizer," Wells remarked with thinly veiled curiosity. "Never thought I'd see you playing the devoted boyfriend. What's your angle?" Emily tensed, waiting for Brian's sharp retort or strategic deflection. Instead, he simply smiled. Not the calculated smile she'd seen in business photos, but the genuine one she'd come to treasure. "No angle, Harrison. Just evolution." The transformation extended beyond public appearances. Emily discovered Brian had begun quietly mentoring young executives, something he'd previously dismissed as a waste of valuable time. He donated to causes without publicity. Most surprisingly, he started declining weekend meetings to spend uninterrupted time with Emily, a boundary he'd never established in 20 years of business. "My assistant almost had a medical emergency when I blocked Saturdays as personal time," he told Emily. With a wry smile, she asked if I needed to see a doctor. 6 months into their relationship, during a weekend at his lake house, Emily found Brian sitting on the dock at sunrise, watching the mist rise off the water. She wrapped a blanket around them both as she joined him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, expecting some contemplation about the beauty before them. "I was thinking about how strange it is," he replied quietly. "All those years I thought vulnerability was weakness. I built an empire on the belief that emotion was a liability." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the dawnlight. "But this feeling, being open with you, letting myself care this much, it's the most courageous thing I've ever done." The words hung between them, simple yet profound in their honesty. Emily realized she was witnessing something remarkable, not just a man falling in love, but a fundamental reimagining of what strength could mean. "Do you miss him?" she asked. The Brian from before. He considered this, his thumb tracing circles on her hand. "Sometimes I miss the certainty. Everything was so clear. Profit, advantage, control." He paused, watching a heron glide across the water. "But I don't miss the emptiness. I never knew it was emptiness until it wasn't there anymore." As Brian watched the ripples dance across the lake's surface, that question began forming in his mind, the one that would require more courage than any boardroom negotiation. After nearly a year with Emily, he knew with absolute certainty that temporary wasn't enough anymore. He wanted forever. Brian fingered the small velvet box hidden in his pocket. Inside nestled a 2-carat oval diamond set in platinum, elegant and timeless, just like Emily. Planning this evening had unleashed a nervousness he hadn't experienced since his first major acquisition. The man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat now found himself rehearsing words in front of his bathroom mirror. The private terrace at Bellini's overlooked the city skyline, string lights creating a canopy of warmth above the single table Brian had reserved. He'd arranged every detail meticulously, from the chef's special menu to the precise moment when the string quartet would begin playing their song. Yet as Emily approached in a midnight blue dress that caught the golden light, Brian forgot every word he'd rehearsed. "This is beautiful," Emily said, taking in the private setting. "What's the occasion?" "Just us," Brian replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Throughout dinner, Brian's usual commanding presence gave way to something Emily hadn't seen before. A subtle nervousness. His fingers drummed briefly against his water glass. His eyes darted to the horizon and back. Emily noticed these small tells, the tiny cracks in his usually perfect composure. "Are you okay?" she asked, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "You seem distracted tonight." "I've never been better," Brian answered, squeezing her fingers. "Just taking it all in." The waiter cleared their dessert plates, and the quartet began playing the waltz they had danced to at the wedding where they'd met. Brian stood, extending his hand, just as he had that night. But this time, there was no challenge in his eyes, only love. They swayed beneath the stars, Emily's head against his chest, feeling the rapid thump of his heartbeat. When the music faded, Brian didn't release her hand. Instead, he took a deep breath and dropped to one knee. "1 year ago, my life was perfectly ordered, predictable, and empty, though I didn't recognize that emptiness until you crashed into it," Brian began, his voice catching slightly. "I never planned for this. I never imagined I'd be here, asking someone to share the rest of my life with me. But then you came along." The ring caught the light as he presented it, but Emily hardly saw it through the tears that sprang to her eyes. This wasn't just Brian proposing. This was the final transformation of a man who once viewed vulnerability as weakness, now embracing it as his greatest strength. "You turned my perfectly controlled world upside down," he continued, "and I've never been happier for it. Emily, will you marry me?" Emily's hands trembled as she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes." As Brian slipped the ring onto her finger, the diners on the main terrace erupted in applause. Brian looked momentarily startled. The private man who once guarded his personal life like a state secret, now exposing his most intimate moment to strangers. But when he looked back at Emily, nothing else mattered. Their kiss sealed more than a proposal. It marked the final chapter of Brian's metamorphosis, from isolated power broker to a man capable of giving and receiving love without reservation. The months of wedding planning flew by in a whirlwind of venue visits, cake tastings, and guest list negotiations. Emily insisted on incorporating elements that honored their unique journey, including table centerpieces featuring pink and white flowers, reminiscent of her scattered bouquet from their first collision. Throughout the process, Brian surprised everyone with his engagement in the details. The man who once delegated every personal task now had opinions on invitation fonts and strong feelings about the dinner menu. When Emily jokingly asked if he'd been body snatched, he simply replied, "Some things are too important to delegate." The morning of their wedding dawned with perfect blue skies and a gentle breeze that seemed orchestrated specifically for them. In separate rooms, bride and groom prepared for the moment that would formalize what their hearts had known for months. Brian stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie with hands that weren't quite steady. His best man, Marcus, watched with amusement. "I've seen you close 9-figure deals without breaking a sweat," Marcus observed. "Never thought I'd see the day when Brian Pfizer was nervous." "This isn't business," Brian replied simply. "This is everything." Down the hall, Emily's mother fastened the last pearl button on her daughter's gown, a sleek, architectural design that reflected her profession while maintaining timeless elegance. "Are you nervous?" her mother asked, smoothing the veil. Emily smiled, touching the ring that hadn't left her finger since the proposal. "Not about marrying him, just about walking in these heels without repeating history." The ceremony site overlooked the same lake, where Brian had first admitted his transformation wasn't complete. Guests filled white chairs on either side of an aisle strewn with flower petals. At the end stood an arch intertwined with greenery and blooms, and beneath it waited Brian, his posture reflecting the confident businessman everyone recognized, but his eyes revealing the man only Emily truly knew. When the music began and Emily appeared at the end of the aisle, a collective breath was taken, but Brian saw only her, the woman who had crashed into his world and rearranged everything in it. As she walked toward him, he remembered every moment that had led them here. The collision, the dance, the kitchen confession, and countless small moments where love had grown in previously barren soil. Their vows weren't traditional. Emily spoke of walls dismantled and unexpected journeys. Brian, the man once known for his economic use of words, delivered heartfelt promises that left few dry eyes among the guests. "With all my heart, yes," Brian stated firmly when asked if he took Emily as his wife. "Yes, yes, forever, yes," Emily replied through happy tears when it was her turn. They were pronounced husband and wife under the same sky that had witnessed their journey from strangers to soulmates. As they sealed their union with a kiss, guests stood in celebration of a love story that defied all expectations. At the reception, Brian surprised Emily by leading her directly to the dance floor for their first dance. No announcement needed, no hesitation in his steps. Unlike their first dance a year ago, there was no question about what would happen when the music stopped. This time, they both knew the music would play on. Their wedding cake featured a whimsical design, a bride figurine that appeared to have collided with the groom, knocking both slightly off balance but bringing them perfectly together. The guests laughed at the inside joke, unaware of how accurately it represented the beautiful chaos that had led to this day. As evening fell and stars appeared above the outdoor reception, Brian pulled Emily away from the celebration for a moment alone. "Any regrets about marrying the man you once spilled wine on?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Emily smiled, remembering the mortified woman she'd been, and marveling at the journey since. "Only that I didn't spill it sooner." When you strip away all the grand gestures and dramatic moments, what remains at the heart of Emily and Brian's story is something profoundly simple, yet revolutionary: the courage to be authentic. Their journey reminds us that love isn't found in perfection, but in those raw, unguarded moments when we're most ourselves. As experts have discovered, vulnerability isn't weakness, but the foundation upon which lasting relationships are built. What makes their story so compelling isn't just the fairy tale elements. It's the fundamental truth that emotional intimacy requires us to remove our masks. Each time Brian allowed Emily to see past his calculated exterior, each time Emily stopped running from her feelings, they weren't just falling in love, they were embracing their authentic selves. The greatest risk was never in that first awkward collision, or even in Brian's bold business decision. It was in those quiet moments when they chose vulnerability over safety, authenticity over armor. Their story teaches us that beyond the comfort zone of our defensive walls lies not just love, but the freedom to be truly seen and accepted, the greatest gift any relationship can offer.